This one's different because it's not a crisis that started, this month. It was already broken. The agricultural sector in Australia, we employed 247,000 people on average last year. It's down more than 10% year on year. The hours worked in agriculture hit their lowest level ever recorded in August 2025. And the Food Supply Chain Alliance estimated that the sector was short 172,000 workers. So paddock to plate before any of this started. But the big one as well is the median age of Australian farmers is now over 53. And in beef, the beef industry, it exceeds 60. You've been in those communities. How did it get this bad without becoming a political crisis?
Any issue is only a political crisis if it's actually been deemed a political vulnerability. So I think, do we really consider it a political crisis, or is it a long-standing issue that remains to require meaningful attention?
Well, it's been something that's been allowed to get worse and worse. So, as with the numbers that I just mentioned, is that we can't get people to stay on the farm. So generationally, that's an issue. Secondly, we can't attract workers. We've opened the Palm scheme, but that's not really working as it should. Pacific Island Labour Scheme. If you can't have people working on properties and farms to get the food out of the ground and to market, well, what do we do?
It's a complex question, and there's a lot of threads to pull on with that issue alone, I think, because it's not just a question of labor on a property. We have workers' rights. We have a belief and political structure that doesn't have forced labor as something that we condone or accept. But on the property is just one part of it. It's a community issue. And it's not just a community issue that applies to agriculture. It applies to who's the nurse at the hospital, who is the person at the fuel station. You have to have services in a community to make it a community. A lot of, is there even a hospital left in this community? So, what's the livability of the areas that we're asking people to live in? And is there childcare?
And you can't have one without the other, right? So you can't have a successfully operational farming operation in a community without the community, without all those things you mentioned, the childcare, the health, the pub. These are all things that why we're seeing towns die, because of that central operation that ceases to exist. That might even be mining. And you've lived in those communities and reported in those communities as well. So I guess I'm just trying to seek a sense of what that perception is in those communities as well, around, well, where is the next lot of, I might talk about labour, whether it's generational people living in those communities who want to be farmers, who want to stay who want to stay in the agri-business. And again, as you know, that's much broader than just farming, but in the agri-business sector.
Absolutely. And I look to my hometown of Mariba as a thriving community. And that hasn't happened by coincidence. That has required a community identity and a community workforce to keep all of those things humming along in unison. And that's also not to say that they don't have labor issues. I look to my cohort of friends that I went through schooling with, and they're now the farmers. And they've either taken over the family farm or they've bought property of their own. A lot of diversification. I don't know too many farmers, particularly in those sorts of regions, whether it's a fruit bowl, or, where there's a major hub for agriculture that doesn't run a diverse operation. But I also see a lot of farmers, landowners having to take on a lot of responsibility and burden and investment in things that I just never witnessed growing up. Backpackers were very prominent part of my community because that was the labor force for all of the farms, but they would live in the community. They would live in the town. There would be caravan parks that were, dedicated to having seasonal backpackers. Now I see a lot of the property owners and the farmers, they have to build accommodation. So the investment starts to spread in a lot of areas. You have inputs for the actual production, but now they've got business inputs for a whole range of other things.
And that labour one's a big one.
Buses.
Yeah, yep, getting people to and from their properties. Look, COVID really put a full stop on the backpacker market working in properties across this country, and that's still being felt because we've obviously had to stand up the Palm scheme to patch some of those gaps. You're talking about older farmers, which again we mentioned the average age a second ago, and they're having to keep putting money into their businesses, and I think the average capital value of a farm at the moment is about $3.3 million. So that's on average, right? That's the capital value. And so you can't just enter the industry as a young person, 19 with no assets. And so, the older cohort has to stay on longer because there's no pathway for new entrants. And I don't see how that's fixable. That demographic ratchet's only going one way at the moment. And, our workforce, 95% of our labour force is casual. And that PALM scheme I was speaking about earlier patches some of the gap, with Pacific Island workers, but that's a supply chain dependency on its own. And talking about sovereignty, we're importing labour to harvest, food grown on imported inputs, shipped on imported fuels, shipped out on imported vessels. So at what point does that become a sovereignty question, getting back to what we were talking about earlier today, rather than a workforce question?
Again, really complex things to straddle because there's multiple threads in that alone. You know, the Palm scheme, as you say, it was filling some gaps, but did we truly consider the gaps in the Pacific Island nations that it was widening? Did we consider the gaps that it was creating in communities that are now responsible for those workers? We can have really good ideas that fix one thing, but are we truly considering the other gap or issue that it might be creating? And I guess when you're talking to a larger point of workforce, what are the incentives? And if one of the things that people are considering is a place that they can settle and create, start a family, have a life, it's a livability factor as much as it is a employment opportunity consideration. To me, yes, we can get bogged down on labor workforce, but it's a much bigger picture about it's a societal consideration. And that's why, we unless you're very specialist of you're a commodities reporter or you're a markets reporter, you're a beef reporter, you generally are considered a rural affairs reporter because agriculture is one part of an ecosystem of rural life. And so our policies potentially are only existing in unison of a broader issue.
And ecosystem. You're right. Uh, let's hold that thought because what I'm building towards is it's a question about what happens when all three of these pressures land on the same farm at the same time. And I think we're really close to that. So here's the frame that I keep coming back to. And any one of these inputs, failures, the fuel, the fertiliser, the labour, it's a manageable policy problem in isolation. 2 simultaneously it's a systems threat. 3 simultaneously with no strategic buffer in any of them is a different category of problem, and I think we're in that 3rd category right now. What are your thoughts there?
I would agree entirely. And I think that's where I draw on the, it's certainly not a blueprint, but it's perhaps a case study or a framework that could be referenced in what we did during COVID, because the fuel stocks were a hell of a lot better then than they are now. The supply routes were much more accessible than they are now. And although we were locked down, we didn't run out of fuel. We didn't run out of fertilizer. And there are lots of alternative options for both of these things, which we, if operating in a different R&D setting, as well as investment, as well as policy, we might have alternatives that could be not just a just in time option, but part of the energy mix and input mix that doesn't exist, not because we don't have options in Australia. It's they're not funded, or they're not financially viable, or there's no market incentive for them to exist. There's an enormous amount of opportunity for not only biofuels from North Queensland, with cane, and we've also got, like you pointed to, options for fertilizer alternatives.
Yeah, and that's an interesting decision set for a farmer with, not only inputs, but things like, you know, with labour, there are ways around it. You know, whether it's invoking, SES or defence or other humans in the chain to if you have to pull something up the ground or shift a box. But fertiliser and fuel, we can't just fashion that out of thin air. So it's interesting to understand, what a farmer thinks about in a farming community. Like you've come from farming communities and you report on that rural setting. If a farmer has to make a decision about what gets cut first, what gets planted less, what gets abandoned, there's a lag problem there, and that interests me. Fuel prices move daily, and you see it at the bowser, and fertiliser impacts show up in the following season's yield, and the labour decisions, about what to plant are made months before the harvest. So, consumer prices lag all of those by another 3 to 12 months, which means the full impact on what's happening right now won't be visible to an Australian supermarket shopper for what? How long do you think? 6 months?
How long or short is a piece of string? is is what I think when it comes to that. Because farmers are some of the most intelligent, resourceful, innovative people that I've met. And I say that very comfortably, having not only been in the army, but in newsrooms and interviewed people across the political spectrum, across the societal spectrum. And for a farmer to actually be able to make a decision that is, forecasted when dealing with all of the problem sets they're facing at the moment, is quite privileged. And I think what we will find is most of them are going to be in a reactive state because they're having to respond with things that are totally out of their control. And they're not in this position because of a misjudgment in forecasting or business expenditure decisions. They're in this position because all of those uh, challenges are, are hitting at once.
Mm. And I guess that's the thing, Kate, like they all are hitting at once and everything's demand driven, demand from the consumer, demand from the supermarkets.
I feel we'll have a supply issue before we have a demand issue.
Oh, without a doubt. I mean, there's resilience in the community. No one's gonna go terribly crazy if you're missing out on lettuces for 12 months. I know my kids wouldn't mind. But the thing is how many farmers can sustain 12 to 24 months of no revenue? And that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about, okay, for a few months without lettuces, people go, "Okay, we can deal with that." 12 months without lettuce is 24 months, but then you're having to rebuild that supply chain. So, if Farmer Smith from, from up north, is out of action for 12 to 24 months, it's not necessarily also about recropping that particular piece of land. It's who is going to do that if Farmer Smith isn't around to do it because he's gone broke or he can't be bothered. And that sort of gets me to that piece. We talked about food sovereignty earlier, Kate, and the way most Australians understand it, it means growing food here, which we do and at scale. But the actual question is whether we can grow food here without depending on adversarial or fragile supply chains for the inputs to grow it. And on that definition, fuel, fertiliser, labour, how sovereign is Australia right now in your mind?
There are some applications or, to labor, for example, some labor is being replaced by tech. Some it's not. And we haven't been for a long time of these, business operations that would be really arduous, requiring human labor are being replaced by tech. And there's pros and cons to that as well. And a lot of people are making decisions potentially because they just don't have the human to do that job, but then they realize they're actually saving a lot of money by not hiring the human for that function, and then they have a productivity gain. But we're talking about issues that go way beyond a tech solution. So in my mind, unless we have a political decision, we don't really have a way out of this. But we also have a lot of self-agency as citizens where we shouldn't be waiting or requiring our government to enforce fuel rationing or to enforce a particular action that has been done with the intent of preservation and maintaining reserves. We also have self agency when living in the cities to say, I don't need to catch an Uber, or I might think twice about driving or, fueling up for this. And I might actually change some of my human behavior habits because I'm thinking of the farmers or the truck drivers or the medical facilities that require all of the same inputs. And if the lights go off at the hospital because there's no backup diesel or energy or you name it, then that starts to trickle down to us in the city as well, that the truck from the regions hasn't been able to deliver the food.
We do have self-agency, I agree with you, but I think over time we've become too reliant on the government and also very selfish. We're used to handouts. There's no resilience in the majority of the population. And I don't think, that people do think in that term, in that thought process. A lot of us do, I think, in our circle, Kate, which is which we're blessed, but I think the majority of people don't. They just think about me, 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 and then they're looking to the government for a solution. It's a government problem, which is very sad, and it's hopefully something that can change, and something like this event. 80 years ago, I remember even growing up as a young fellow, my mother talking about food rationing. They had to live on dripping and bread, and I'm like, "What the hell is dripping?" And when she told me about it, I was like, "You're kidding." Nope, that's what they had to do. So maybe this is a correction we need to have from a societal perspective. But Kate, I want to think about what a serious country would do. And you've covered defence, you've covered ag, you've covered national security as one interconnected story. If you were briefing the National Security Committee cabinet tomorrow, covering fuel, fertiliser and label as a single integrated risk, what's the first thing that you would put on the table?
All be terrified if I was briefing um, myself as well as the people on the other side of the table. But what I would point to are some very credible and key assessments, documents, papers that have been developed and authored by people who spend a lot of time thinking about this stuff and generating very thorough analysis that could just at least be considered. And I'm not sure that we've had a good track record of considering some of this information and analysis and assessments that have been given and presented to our decision makers. Just last year, we had Australia's first green paper written by Andrew Henderson on national food security preparedness. That's someone with a policy background, a agricultural background, very skilled and knowledgeable in biosecurity and a number of policy points within agriculture. But this report was commissioned by the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. So it's come from a national security think tank. That to me is insightful and revealing in itself. We've had our first green paper on such a topic in 2025. I would also point to another publication that has just landed this week, and I want to ensure that I get the correct naming conventions of that one. So bear with me while I bring it up. But I guess the point that I'm getting to is it's less of a we're talking about, really sovereign issues, but I think sometimes we also lose sight of the fact that we exist regionally and we are part of a region that is very reliant on each other. That won't change. So I think we need to start looking to have regional partners as well in terms of what they're doing. I look to Singapore, I look to Japan, Indonesia. I mean, we've got a very complex relationship with China. All of these things have to be considered, not just in terms of how they integrate and influence our position and policy on this stuff, but also they have their own sovereign case studies.
So there's plenty of intel to lean on.
A very timely publication that has just landed this week, the Australian Quarterly. And I'll just quickly run through some of the contents topics that are covered in this one. Resources tax and Australia's sovereign defence, critical minerals and new Australian export industries, from strategic vulnerability to economic power with a roadmap, reforming procurement to rebuild sovereign capability, the need for an Australian national resilience framework. I mean, people are thinking about this stuff. This was edited by Assistant Professor Matt Darling, and a number of those articles have been authored by very credible and deep thinking academics as well as people from across policy. I think what I would like to see is that it's not left to journalists like me digging deep to find these documents and publications and papers and reports to and then reading them, presenting them. It should just be accessible in to the broader public.
Mm. So the first thing you'd put on the table is don't reinvent the wheel. The information's there, grip it up, get to work. Kate, we opened with a farmer at a low fuel bowser with a paddock still to turn. 3 inputs under pressure, no buffer. The clock's running. What's your honest read? Do we fill the tanks before it matters, or do we wait till it's empty?
I think we've got two answers there, depending on who we're talking to. So the farmers need to fill their tanks, and generally, they have tanks on property, depending, again, it's a proximity issue, how far they are from their town centre, but they need to be the priority. We shouldn't have the, inner city road user filling jerry cans and having stocks at home, because there's a whole other problem set that comes with that in itself. How are they securing that fuel? How are they preventing spillage or spoilage? I think it has to be a priority for the farmers, but equally, we need to deprioritize it in centres where we just need to change our behaviour. You and I are very privileged to live in Queensland when it comes to public transport. There's We've got 50-cent fares. Yes, we benefit from that disproportionately in Brisbane compared to regional and rural centres. But that's also the argument to keep the fuel for the people that don't have access to the conveniences that we do.
To people that need it. What if we looked at it from a metaphorical lens? You know, I would say that the tanks are already empty and we should have been filling them years ago by creating systems that actually work, supply chains that are connected, and sovereignty.
At my core, I would say I'm an optimist. And I I see, the problem of the past being obsolete because we can only respond to what we have in front of us to then future proof. And I think that this all needs to be addressed and considered with very clear and calm, concise thinking.
So, Kate, last question. You've spent your career in rooms where agriculture and national security are treated as entirely separate problems. If you could get those rooms in the same conversation using fuel, fertiliser, and labour as the bridge, what's the one thing that you'd want them to walk out agreeing on?
It's national security.
We opened this conversation with a farmer at a low bowser. The paddock still to turn. A decision with consequences measured in tonnes. What Kate unpacked is that the bowser is one problem. The fertiliser that should have arrived from the Gulf, that's another. The workers who aren't there to bring in the harvest, that's a third. 3 inputs, 3 broken supply chains, running simultaneously, with no strategic buffer in any of them. Most Australians won't see any of this coming. Not through a policy announcement, not through a news cycle. They'll see it the way they always do, at the checkout. A higher number, a shorter shelf, a gap where something used to be. By the time the supermarket tells you there's a problem, every decision that could have prevented it has already been made. Or worse, not made. Australia produces enough food to feed 3 times its population. It's currently unable to guarantee the fuel, the fertiliser, or the workforce to keep doing it. That is not a supply chain story. That is a sovereignty story, and it deserves to be treated as one. Kate Banville, thank you for this conversation. If this episode sharpened something or started an argument, find us at Vaxxer Bureau. The link's in the notes. This is Intelligence Optimised. I'm Todd Crowley. Be ready for today, prepared for tomorrow.